Confessions of Gravediggers, about whispers that were never explained.
I need to tell you something that to this day haunts me like a shadow that never leaves. During all my years working as a gravedigger in one of New York's oldest cemeteries, the silence of the early morning has always been my constant companion. Some say cemeteries hold only memories, but I've learned that there are secrets buried there that no one would dare imagine. One of these hidden truths lies in a specific tomb, a grave that at first glance seems ordinary but at midnight transforms into a portal to the inexplicable. It wasn't uncommon to hear stories from old servants about apparitions among the tombstones, about figures walking slowly between mausoleums, but what I experienced couldn't compare to any of those legends. The first time I heard that sound, I thought it was my mind playing tricks, perhaps the wind pushing through invisible cracks, creating strange echoes. Yet there was a crucial difference. The whispers had a cadence, a weight, the intonation of someone trying to communicate. It was as if a muffled voice struggled against the earth to be heard. It's hard to describe what I felt because it wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, a sense that that voice wasn't calling just anyone, but rather choosing me, calling me by the name I would never reveal to anyone in that place. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more insistent the whispers became, until they became impossible to deny. But that was just the beginning, because the following night would reveal something that would completely change my relationship with that cemetery. If you enjoy this kind of dark story and want to hear even more disturbing confessions from gravediggers, subscribe to the channel now and leave your like to strengthen the continuity of these stories. The next night, when I returned to work, I carried with me the strange memory of that muffled sound that seemed to insist on refusing to leave me. Even though I tried to rationalize what had happened during the day, attributing it to natural noises or even accumulated fatigue, there was a restlessness within me that prevented me from feeling at peace, as if something were lurking, waiting only for darkness to return, to manifest itself again. The cemetery at that hour was so silent it seemed almost solid, and every step I took on the gravel echoed like an intrusion into a place that didn't want me there. As I walked the same path between the graves, trying to reassure myself that nothing unusual would happen again, my ears were filled with that murmur again, only this time it was clearer, more insistent, as if it came directly from the depths of the earth beneath the same grave that had previously disturbed me. I stopped, closed my eyes, and held my breath, hoping I would be able to discern whether it was the wind or some other logical explanation, but what I heard immediately paralyzed me. It was a clear call, a drawn-out, almost choked sound that formed familiar syllables until it became clear enough that I could no longer deny it. It was my name. For a few seconds, my thoughts scrambled in despair, and a part of me wanted to run away, abandon the shovel, the records, and the entire craft that had accompanied me for so many years. Yet something stronger held me still, as if the whispers themselves were ingrained in my bones, preventing any attempt at escape. Little did I know that that call would be just the first step in an obsession that would soon become impossible to control. The days that followed were marked by a silent torment that infiltrated every aspect of my life. Even though I tried to maintain a normal routine, the memory of those whispers remained etched in my mind like a scar that wouldn't fade. As time passed, the uneasiness went from being a passing fear to an obsession that consumed me at every moment, whether at work or at home. Every time I walked the rows of tombstones, I felt the presence of that voice accompanying me, even when the wind was still and the night seemed still. There wasn't a single moment when I didn't feel like I was being watched by invisible eyes hidden in the darkness between the graves. I tried to resist this influence, but the more I tried to push that memory away, the stronger it grew. I soon realized that it wasn't just in the cemetery that I heard the whispers anymore. They began to follow me, even in my dreams, invading my nights with the same muffled cadence that called my name, causing me to wake up. Sweating and desperate, unable to tell if I was still asleep or if the sound was actually echoing inside my room. It was at this point that I decided to use an old tape recorder, believing I could capture proof that my sanity wasn't being corroded by illusions. The first few tapes returned with only static, but as I continued to listen, some of the recordings began to reveal something different. Fragments of incomplete words, low moans, intervals of silence interrupted by sudden interference, that when listened to carefully seemed to form short, though disjointed sentences. One, however, remained forever etched in my memory, because amidst the metallic hiss, I could clearly make out the sentence, "I'm down here." At that moment, I realized that fear had become a trap, because now I wasn't just trying to avoid the whispers, but I was compelled to discover the truth behind them, even if that truth took me to places from which I might never return. When the obsession had already eroded part of my sanity, I realized I could no longer live simply reacting to the fear surrounding me, because the whispers seemed unwilling to disappear, and with each passing night, I found myself more trapped within an invisible web that pulled me toward that tomb. It was then that I decided that to try to understand what was happening, I would need to turn to the cemetery records, even though I knew that rummaging through old archives meant opening doors many preferred to keep closed. The room where the documents were stored was cold and damp, lit by dim lamps that cast long shadows on the walls, and as I leafed through the dusty books, I felt as if each page carried with it an energy that should not be awakened. After hours of searching, I found the information that froze my blood. Buried in that grave was a woman named Margaret Holloway, who died under mysterious circumstances in the 1950s. The official record simply stated, "Death by sudden collapse," but alongside it were handwritten notes by former employees suggesting another version, mentioning that during the wake, several people claimed to hear sounds coming from inside the coffin, as if the deceased were still breathing or trying to communicate. For some, it was a sign that she had been buried alive. For others, it was proof that Margaret had been accused of witchcraft in her community, and that her death had not been an accident, but rather the result of dark rituals practiced in secret. As I read those lines, I felt a deep chill run down my spine, because suddenly everything seemed to fit together. The whispers I'd heard weren't a figment of my imagination, but rather the continuation of something that had begun decades ago. And yet, within me arose the most disturbing question of all. If those sounds had been recorded since the wake, why did they seem directed at me? As if there were a personal connection between my existence and hers. And it was this question that led me to make the riskiest decision of all, because I knew the only way to get an answer would be to face the tomb directly, exactly at the time when the whispers became impossible to ignore. The decision to face the grave that rainy night was made as if something greater than my own will had guided me there, because no matter how hard I tried to resist, there was a force that drew me back to the same spot, as if the grave were a magnet, and I a lump of metal unable to escape its gravity. The cemetery was plunged into near utter darkness, interrupted only by the sporadic flashes of lightning that tore through the sky, casting grotesque shadows over the mausoleums and making every tree look like a shape about to move. I walked slowly to Margaret Holloway's grave, carrying a portable recorder that I held tightly, though my hands were shaking. The clock read 11:58 p.m. when I knelt before the headstone, feeling the chill of the sodden earth seeping through my clothes. Time seemed to drag cruelly, as if each second were longer than the last, and when the hands finally reached midnight, the air around me grew thick, almost unbreathable. First came the low murmur, the same muffled sound that had tormented me so many times before, but within moments it transformed into a chorus of voices, as if dozens of invisible throats echoing simultaneously, begging for help, pleading to be heard. The ground vibrated beneath my feet, and for the first time I felt as if the earth not only hid, but also contained something that longed to escape. On the recorder, the needle oscillated wildly, registering strong interference, and amid the sonic chaos, a voice emerged, clear, piercing, calling my name again. I tried to respond, but my throat closed in panic, for the voice no longer pleaded for help. It claimed to know my identity, as if there were an intimate connection between us that should never exist. "I know who you are," the voice said, and in that instant the world seemed to crumble around me, because this wasn't just a supernatural manifestation, it was a direct, personal revelation, as if the entity had broken through the barriers of death to reach me. My knees weakened, my hands nearly dropped the recorder, and yet I remained motionless, a prisoner of fear and fascination, because part of me needed to hear more, needed to understand what lay behind that terrifying declaration. But what happened next was even more disturbing, and the mark that this experience left on my soul would never be erased, because the confession that came after would definitively transform my view on life, death, and the silence of cemeteries. After that night, nothing in my life was the same again, because what I witnessed before that tomb was beyond any rational explanation. To this day, I wonder if I truly remained conscious, or if part of me was sucked into a state where time and reality no longer have any meaning. The whispers didn't cease. They simply transformed, becoming a constant presence, as if they had penetrated the walls of the tomb and found refuge within my mind. There are nights when I wake with a start, with the sensation that someone is at my bedside, quietly repeating the same phrases I heard that morning. At those times I realize that no matter how hard I try to escape, the connection with Margaret Holloway can never be undone. I can no longer approach that grave without feeling my legs tremble and the air thin in my lungs, because the memory of the voice calling my name still resonates like a dark warning that something greater is afoot, something beyond human comprehension. So here's my only advice. If you ever go to that cemetery, never walk alone after midnight. And if you happen to hear any sound coming from the earth, don't make the same mistake I did. Don't stop, don't listen, simply run away before it's too late. And if you think this is the most disturbing story a gravedigger has ever shared, wait until you hear the next one, because there are secrets buried in cemeteries across this country that would make you beg to never close your eyes at night again. There are secrets hidden in the walls of certain places, as if the stone itself had learned to conceal what should never be heard. And that was precisely the feeling I had the first time I stepped into the ossuary at St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 in New Orleans, a space that holds centuries of stories, buried beneath layers of silence and superstition. I always knew that working among bones and sealed drawers required more than physical strength. It also required the ability to live with solitude and the knowledge that each corridor holds memories that do not belong to the world of the living. But nothing prepared me for what I discovered there. For years, I'd heard comments from visitors and even some older employees who swore the ossuary had a life of its own, as if the walls breathed on sultry nights. Although I always laughed at these stories, there was a part of me that harbored a restless curiosity, almost as if I knew that at some point I would have to confirm for myself whether it was all just a figment of popular imagination. The sensation of walking through that heavy gate always gave me an inexplicable chill, and over time I realized it wasn't just the architecture or the age of the place, but an energy that seemed to vibrate almost imperceptibly, like a silent warning that something there didn't want to be disturbed. And it was in this scenario of constant darkness that the first signs began to manifest themselves in such a subtle way that at first glance they could be mistaken for echoes or random noises, but which would soon reveal a pattern impossible to ignore. If you enjoy this kind of dark story and want to hear even more disturbing confessions from gravediggers, subscribe to the channel now and leave your like to strengthen the continuity of these stories. It was on one of those muggy mornings, when the heat seemed to trap the air within the thick walls of the ossuary, that something happened that forever changed the way I saw that place. I walked slowly between the rows of sealed drawers, carrying only a flashlight that dimly illuminated the names engraved on the bronze plaques, already corroded by time. And with each step I took, the silence became more oppressive, as if it were pushing me into a void of no return. It was at that moment that I heard, almost imperceptibly, a muffled sound coming from the wall to my right, so low it could have been mistaken for the distant rustling of leaves moved by the wind. But there was no wind that night. I approached cautiously, pressing my ear against the cool surface of the stone, and it was then that I realized it wasn't a random noise, but rather a sequence of drawn-out syllables, repeated in cadence, as if a voice were trying to form words. At first I thought it was my imagination fueled by fatigue, but as the seconds passed, the sounds gained consistency, acquiring a rhythm reminiscent of a prayer, only inverted, distorted, as if someone were reciting a prayer in a language not of this world. My entire body reacted instinctively, shivers running across my skin like tiny electric shocks. And no matter how hard I tried to retreat, a part of me was entangled in that murmur, unable to break the invisible thread connecting me to the voice. It grew clearer and clearer, more and more insistent, until I came to the disturbing realization that no matter what language it was spoken in, that message was meant for me. And it was at that point that I understood that I was not faced with simple echoes of a forgotten past, but with something that had intention, something that had chosen me, and what would happen next would only confirm the weight of that revelation. After that night, each time I set foot in the ossuary, the feeling of being watched intensified, as if dozens of invisible eyes were watching me from within the sealed drawers. Even as I tried to convince myself it was all just a hallucination caused by fatigue, something inside me knew there was no turning back, because the murmurs had already crossed the line between the inexplicable and the inevitable. What had previously manifested itself subtly now became more aggressive, as if the entire wall were breathing in irregular intervals, emitting words I didn't understand, but which somehow penetrated my mind and echoed like silent commands. There were moments when the sound would emerge from different points at once, as if multiple voices were trapped in distinct compartments, chanting disjointed phrases that intertwined into a disturbing chorus. Other times, the words would concentrate in a single location, always on the same main wall, and in those moments the room seemed to react, the air growing heavier, the lights flickering, and I had the distinct impression that if I didn't move away, something would be able to breach the barrier between what was sealed and what was alive. The most terrifying thing was the insistent cadence, because it sounded not like a plea but a demand, as if the voice wanted not just to be heard but obeyed, and that thought slowly eroded any sense of security I might still harbor. I even avoided that hallway, making excuses for other employees to perform tasks that were normally mine. But even so, the voices followed me, whispering in moments of absolute silence, infiltrating my dreams and transforming my nights into a cycle of shock and cold sweat. I could no longer tell if I was going mad or if I had truly been chosen to hear what should never have been revealed. And it was precisely this doubt that drove me to the next step, because I needed to find an answer in the ancient records before reason itself abandoned me. I had no idea that what I would discover in the cemetery archives would be even more terrifying than the voices themselves, and that the dusty pages would reveal secrets that should never have been brought to light. I then decided to seek answers in the dusty archives stored in a locked room at the back of the cemetery. A space few dared to visit, and which reeked of aged paper mixed with the humidity that seemed to never leave those walls. As I thumbed through the yellowed records and folders, I noticed that each page carried a heavy atmosphere, as if simply reading those names was enough to awaken memories that preferred to remain dormant. For hours, I searched for references to the main wall of the ossuary, and just when I was about to give up, my eyes fell upon a notebook stained with faded ink, where former employees had recorded events that had never been made public. It was at that moment that I discovered the connection I had so feared. Those specific drawers held the remains of immigrants who arrived in New Orleans in the 19th century. Many of them involved in practices linked to secret societies and forbidden rituals, practices that blended local Catholicism with elements of voodoo and ancestral ceremonies that should never have been repeated. The record described that these people were not buried in a common manner, but purposefully sealed within the walls with occult ritual inscriptions, as if the intention was not just to preserve their bodies, but to imprison something they carried within. As I read the accounts of witnesses from the time, a chill ran down my spine as I realized that even back then, some had reported hearing murmurs coming from the newly sealed drawers, voices speaking in unknown languages that reportedly drove gravediggers working nearby mad. All of this made me understand that the voices I was hearing were not a recent phenomenon, but a cursed inheritance that had spanned generations, like an endless echo trapped between stone and bone. And if up until that point I believed that the whispers were just a directionless manifestation, the revelations of the records made me understand that there was a clear reason for those voices to exist, and that reason would become impossible to ignore the night I finally decided to face them head-on. I had reached the point where ignoring the whispers was no longer possible, for they infiltrated every moment of my life, becoming as present as breathing itself. So I decided the only way to end this torment would be to face the ossuary at its most intense hour, the early morning hours when the city slept and shadows seemed to grow around every corner. I chose a rainy night, believing the roar of the storm might drown out any strange sounds. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter, because what awaited me could not be silenced by natural forces. I walked slowly through the drenched cemetery, the lantern wavering in my trembling hands, until I reached the ossuary's heavy gate, which creaked open as if it too resisted my entry. Inside, the darkness was almost absolute, with only the yellowish light of the flashlight cutting through the damp air. I placed the recorder on the floor, right against the main wall, and remained motionless as I watched the clock's hands creep toward midnight. At the precise moment the distant chimes sounded, the room seemed to transform, for the air became so dense that breathing became a painful task. Then murmurs arose, first faint, then louder, until they became a chorus of voices vibrating in unison, filling every corner of the suffocating space. The drawers began to tremble slightly, as if something were trying to move from the other side, and no matter how hard I fought the instinct to flee, my legs remained glued to the floor, unable to move. Away! The chorus of voices intensified until it became a deafening chant, an inverted melody that made me lose track of time and space. Until from within that mass of sound a stronger voice emerged, deep and cutting, as if coming not just from the walls, but from within me. This voice didn't repeat strange syllables. It articulated one word I understood clearly, a single command that pierced my body like an icy blade. Open. And it was in that instant, paralyzed before the impossible, that I realized that the ossuary was not just holding bones, but imprisoning something that should never be freed. Something that now seemed determined to use me as the key to cross the barriers of eternal silence. After that night, I understood that I would never cross the ossuary gate in the same way again, because something within me had been violated, as if the whispered command had not only been heard, but engraved within my mind with the force of a curse. Since then, every time I walk near the walls of that corridor, I feel an invisible weight watching me, a burden that becomes almost unbearable, as if dozens of voices still echoed within my skull, repeating at irregular intervals the same command I could never forget. It didn't matter if I covered my ears, moved away from the place, or even avoided looking in the direction of those drawers, because the word always returned, always found a way to penetrate the silence of the night and lodge itself once again in the depths of my unconsciousness. I began to have recurring nightmares in which the ossuary was no longer made of stone, but of pulsating flesh, and the drawers opened by themselves, revealing mouths murmuring in languages I didn't understand, languages that made me wake up drenched in sweat and with the sensation that something had walked around my bed while I slept. I tried to convince myself they were just dreams, reflections of psychological trauma, but every time I return to the cemetery, I feel the same. Pressure in my lungs, the same vibration in the walls, as if at any moment that command would be uttered again, waiting only for me to give in. Just one warning. If you ever visit New Orleans and decide to enter St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, stay away from the ossuary walls. They still speak, and believe me when I say there are secrets that just can't bear to be revealed. And if you think this is the scariest account you've ever heard from a gravedigger, wait until you hear the next story, because there are even more disturbing confessions that would make anyone wish they'd never set foot in a cemetery in the wee hours of the morning. On that cold night, the sky seemed to weigh down on us like a leaden vault, and Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in New York City became even more ominous under the pale moonlight that barely illuminated the stone paths between the ancient tombs. I'd always believed that nighttime burials carried a more somber atmosphere than necessary, because the darkness not only hid people's faces, but also gave life to shadows, each of them seemingly watching with invisible eyes what was happening around them. The wind blew irregularly, bringing with it the smell of damp earth already prepared to receive another body, and the family members, gathered in silence, formed a circle heavy with sadness that mingled with the biting chill of the early morning. As I adjusted the shovel beside the newly dug grave, I discreetly observed the ceremony taking place a few meters ahead, led by the priest who recited the last words in a low voice, as if the night itself had swallowed his prayers. The scene alone would be enough to make anyone uncomfortable, but there was something about the setting that transcended the simple act of burying a body. Something that seemed to lurk between the lines of silence, as if waiting for the exact moment to manifest itself. It wasn't just a burial, it was a ritual shrouded in an aura no one could name, and I didn't know I was about to witness the moment when death would cease to be merely absence and become presence. And it was in this dense and almost unbreathable atmosphere that an unexpected sound began to break the solemnity of the ceremony. Something so strange that it made every eye lift with suspicion and fear. If you enjoy this kind of dark story and want to hear even more disturbing confessions from gravediggers, subscribe to the channel now and leave your like to strengthen the continuity of these stories. At first, I thought it was just an impression created by the wind, a passing noise that filtered through the trees and blended with the creaking of branches. But as my ears adjusted to the early morning silence, I realized something was different, something that didn't fit any natural explanation. The sound was low, almost a wail, but clear enough for me to make out the cadence of a suppressed cry, a muffled sob that seemed to come from within the freshly turned earth. I remained still, gripping the shovel tightly, feeling my fingers grow numb as I tried to convince myself that I was mistaken, that my mind, already charged by the tension of the environment, was playing a cruel trick. The problem was that the more I tried to ignore it, the clearer the crying became, until there was no longer any doubt as to its source. It wasn't coming from the family members gathered around the coffin, nor from some distant corner of the cemetery. The sound was emerging directly from the open grave in front of me, as if someone, trapped in the darkness of the coffin, was still struggling to be heard. The chill that ran down my spine was so intense that for a moment I forgot to even breathe, and each beat of my heart felt like a hammer echoing inside my head, keeping time with that impossible-to-ignore wail. As the priest continued the prayer, I noticed some family members starting to look at each other uneasily, as if they'd also heard that strange lament, but were hesitant to admit it. I knew I wasn't alone in this perception, and this detail only heightened the tension, because if anyone else was also hearing it, then what was happening wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was at that moment that I understood that something terrible was about to reveal itself, because when the suspicious gazes of those present turned to me, there was no denying that they had all heard the same disturbing sound. The moment I realized I wasn't the only one listening completely transformed the atmosphere of the ceremony, because the suppressed murmur of just seconds before now became the object of collective attention, and every fear-filled look confirmed what I had been struggling to deny until then. An elderly woman, probably the deceased's aunt, put her hand to her mouth in a gesture of horror, while another younger relative backed away slowly, as if wanting to move away from the grave, but lacking the courage to run and admit the terror that gripped him. The priest, trying to maintain his composure, briefly interrupted his prayer, lowered his eyes to the freshly turned earth, and swallowed hard, unable to continue. With the same firmness as before, it was then that murmurs began among the family members, each trying to interpret what was happening in their own way. Some, overcome with panic, suggested in hushed tones that the deceased was still alive, that the burial had been rushed, and that the weeping was the last desperate effort of someone fighting death. Others, more superstitious, whispered of curses, claiming that the deceased's soul had not found rest, and that we were witnessing a sign that something wrong had been done. Chaos began to ensue, and voices mingled with nervous sobs, as if mourning itself had transformed into a state of collective terror. The most disturbing thing, however, was not just hearing the repeated crying, but noticing that the sound was gaining intensity, changing in tone, as if rising toward the surface. I could have sworn that the wail was no longer trapped at the bottom of the grave, but was slowly climbing the earthen walls, approaching the world of the living with terrifying insistence. It was at that moment that my heart sank, for I realized that the ceremony could no longer continue as before, and that we were facing something beyond human control. And while everyone waited in tense silence for the decision on what should be done, I realized that the responsibility would fall on us to confirm what was really happening inside that coffin. The tension had become a palpable mass that seemed to suffocate us, and as much as no one wanted to admit it out loud, it was clear that everyone was waiting for just a gesture from me or any other employee to confirm what was happening inside that coffin. My hands trembled, and cold sweat trickled down the back of my neck as I slowly approached the edge of the grave, trying to ignore the weight of the stairs fixed on my back. One of the attendants, as pale as I was, joined me, and together we descended a few steps of the makeshift ladder until we were close enough to clearly hear the muffled sound that still echoed. It was at that moment that I realized it wasn't just an indistinct cry, but a rhythmic wail, accompanied by dry thumps against the wood, as if desperate hands were pounding on the lid, seeking a way out. I placed my ear against the surface of the coffin, and the almost imperceptible vibration ran across my face, confirming beyond a shadow of a doubt that something was moving inside. The attendant immediately recoiled, crossing his arms over his chest in an instinctive gesture of self-protection, while the family erupted in desperate cries, begging us to open the coffin before it was too late. The priest tried in vain to quell the commotion, telling us we needed to act calmly, but with each passing second, the sound seemed more urgent, closer, as if the wooden walls were about to give way. It was in this unbearable dilemma that I found myself trapped. Open up in front of everyone and reveal something perhaps no one was prepared to see, or keep the coffin closed and forever carry the guilt of having ignored a call that seemed too human to dismiss. I looked around, and every pleading face pushed me toward the decision I dreaded. But before I could act, something unexpected happened, completely altering the course of that night. Because the moment we prepared to remove the lid, the crying stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so deep it seemed impossible to bear. The silence that followed was so abrupt that for a moment I felt as if my ears had stopped working. For the entire atmosphere of the cemetery seemed to have been sucked into a suffocating void, leaving only the distant sound of the family's heavy breathing and the creaking of trees shaken by the night wind. What had been so intense seconds before had now vanished without a trace, and the sudden absence of the weeping was even more disturbing than its presence, for the void seemed to scream louder than any lament. I remained motionless, my hand resting on the coffin lid, expecting the sound to return at any moment. But the longer I waited, the more unbearable the silence became, piercing every thought like a blade. The family, however, did not calm down. On the contrary, the sudden cessation of the noises only intensified their despair, because now everyone believed we had taken too long, that whatever life still lingered within had been suffocated by our hesitation. Amidst screams, tears, and pleas, the pressure became unbearable, and there was no retreat. I ordered the assistant to help lift the lid, and with heavy, trembling movements, we began to remove the latches holding it in place. The cold air that escaped as we opened a small crack brought with it a strong smell of damp wood and earth, but no sign of movement or sound emerged. When we finally lifted the lid completely, what we saw was an inert body, perfectly still, with no sign of struggle or breathing. The deceased's expression remained serene, as if he had been in eternal sleep from the very first moment. However, something immediately caught my attention. The inside of the lid was marked by deep scratches, irregular lines that defied any logical explanation, because according to the records, the body had been placed with its hands carefully crossed over its chest, with no possibility of such violent marks being produced. I brought the flashlight closer and noticed that among the scratches were also disconnected symbols, almost like hastily scrawled inscriptions, but none of them resembled familiar words. And it was in that instant that I understood that perhaps what we had heard wasn't exactly human, but something that had found in the body merely a temporary passage to manifest itself. It was there, faced with that silent and terrifying discovery, that I realized that we had not yet reached the end of the nightmare, because the true confession of that burial was only beginning to reveal itself. After that night, I could never again attend a night funeral without feeling that something invisible was walking beside me, because the memory of the marks on the coffin lid and the muffled weeping echoes inside my head to this day, like a wound that never heals. Some claimed the marks were the result of a collective hallucination. Others said they might have been the result of the humidity and the old wood. But I know what I saw, and I know what I heard, because that wailing wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was real, intense, and made it clear that there was a presence there that refused to be ignored. What torments me to this day is the certainty that it wasn't just a lost soul crying out for help, but something much greater, something that found a way in that moment to manifest itself before us all. The family never spoke of what happened again, as if silence were the only way to preserve sanity. But among the gravediggers, the story spread like a shared scar, a secret that circulated in whispers and heavy glances each time the subject arose. I, in turn, began to carry a constant suspicion that it didn't end at Sleepy Hollow, because in other cemeteries, on other early mornings, I witnessed similar echoes, always linked to open graves, as if it were a pattern, a repeated curse that moved from land to land, choosing new places to reveal itself. I leave you with a warning. If you ever stand before a coffin about to be buried and hear any sound coming from the earth, don't hesitate, because there are secrets that should never be revealed. And if this story already seemed disturbing, wait until you hear the next one, when the darkness of a silent wake showed that death has even more perverse ways of manifesting itself. There are places that, even abandoned, seem to have never lost their ability to tell stories, and Boot Hill Cemetery in Kansas is one such place whose ruins carry a living memory, as if every stone and every worn cross still held secrets from a time when death was more frequent than life. When I was assigned to do nightly rounds in that abandoned cemetery, I believed it would be just another routine job, a forgotten space where the only sound would be the distant whistle of the wind cutting through the arid fields. I never imagined, not even in my worst nightmares, that that wind didn't simply cut through the empty space, but carried with it something deeper, something that seemed to be born from the forgotten graves themselves. My first impression was that the silence wasn't absolute, because even with no one around, there was always the sensation of voices accompanying my steps. The wind seemed to shape itself into loose, drawn-out words that dissipated into the air before I could fully understand them. For a while, I tried to convince myself they were merely echoes created by the geography of the place, but deep down, there was a strange cadence to those sounds, a cadence that didn't match simple natural noises. And it was precisely at this point that doubt turned into uneasiness, because I realized that I was not just hearing disconnected breaths, but fragments of phrases that seemed to have been intended for my ears, as if the wind had become the messenger of something that remained buried and should never have been heard. But it was the first night I could clearly make out a name amidst those whispers that I understood the danger was just beginning. If you enjoy this kind of dark story and want to hear even more disturbing confessions from gravediggers, subscribe to the channel now and leave your like to strengthen the continuity of these stories. That night, as the wind blew through the rusted gates and creaked the dry trees that still resisted abandonment, I sensed something different approaching, for the sounds were no longer formless whispers, but took on an almost hypnotic rhythm, as if shaped by a hidden intention. I walked slowly among the moss-covered tombstones, and with each step, the whispers became clearer, escaping the air as if fragments of a conversation I shouldn't be hearing. At first, I tried to rationalize it, believing it might be the effect of fatigue or the wind channeling through the ancient structures. But as the words began to gain clarity, I understood it wasn't the product of my weary mind. I leaned against one of the worn wooden crosses, closed my eyes, and let the sound wash over me. And it was at that moment that the cadence revealed something disturbing. Names were being spoken, one after the other, carried by a drawn-out intonation that seemed to traverse time. The first name echoed in my mind with an undeniable clarity, and the shock was immediate, for it was someone I knew personally, a man from the community who was still alive, healthy, and present in the daily life of the small town. I felt my blood run cold and my breath grow heavy, as if each syllable had the power to pull me into an invisible abyss. I tried to move away, but I realized that the further I retreated, the more the wind insisted on bringing disconnected words that wove themselves together into incomplete sentences, as if a chorus of ancient voices was struggling to cross the barrier that separates the world of the living and the dead. It was there that I understood, with growing dread, that those names were not being mentioned by chance, but followed a dark order that I was not yet able to comprehend. And what would come in the following nights would prove that there was no coincidence at all. The following nights became an inescapable torment, because I could no longer approach the cemetery without feeling the wind waiting only for my presence to speak again, as if my arrival were the trigger that awakened those voices trapped among the tombstones. At first, I considered avoiding the rounds, making excuses, or even requesting a transfer, but something in my mind kept pushing me back, a mixture of fear and fascination that kept me trapped in that routine, as if I'd been chosen to carry a secret no one else should know. It was during one of these early mornings that I realized the gravity of what was happening. The wind returned stronger, howling across the dry hills and transforming once again into slurred words. This time, however, the voice brought not just one name, but several, each spoken more clearly than the last, and all belonging to living people in the community. I knew them by sight: neighbors, local merchants, men and women who walked the streets during the day, unaware that their names echoed among the tombstones at night. I wrote some of them down on a crumpled piece of paper, unable to explain why, simply obeying an impulse that seemed greater than myself. Days. Later, as I passed the local newspaper displayed in the window, my heart stopped for a moment. One of the names I'd heard was printed there, in the obituaries section, accompanied by the news of a sudden and unexplained death. My stomach churned, and at the same time a sense of despair washed over me, because it wasn't a coincidence, it was a warning I didn't want to hear. From that moment on, what had previously seemed like just a disturbing phenomenon began to reveal itself as a list, a gradual count of lives about to be lost. And it was then that I realized I could no longer ignore it, because each new whisper could carry someone's fate, and perhaps even my own name was about to be spoken. The obsession with understanding what really happened in that abandoned cemetery began to consume my days as much as my nights, because it was no longer possible to simply continue living, knowing that the names whispered by the wind would, days later, become news stories printed in local obituaries. I began carrying a small notebook with me where I jotted down every word I could make out, every name the wind seemed to spit out with the precision of a sentence. At first, I tried to keep those notes secret, as if hiding them could contain their significance, but the list grew rapidly, and I soon realized I held in my hands a dark record that shouldn't exist. Driven by dread and the need for answers, I searched the city's old archives, delving into documents covering decades of forgotten history. There I found accounts of employees who had undergone similar experiences, night watchmen who swore they heard voices in the wind and who, shortly thereafter, disappeared without a trace. Some of these records mentioned the same cemetery, always describing disconnected sentences and lists of names that tragically confirmed themselves as the days went by. With each line I read, the certainty grew within me. This was not a recent phenomenon, but a curse that had spanned generations. However, nothing prepared me for the discovery that completely paralyzed my body. Among the old notes, written in shaky, nearly illegible handwriting, I found the repetition of several names that had already appeared on my own recent list. But among them, there was one that made my heart race and my hands tremble to the point of nearly dropping the notebook. My own name was there, recorded decades earlier, as if it had been chosen long before I was even born. It was at that moment that I understood that the whispers were not only predicting deaths, they were surrounding me in a cycle from which I might never escape, and the revelation that would come the following night would confirm the worst of my fears. The following night arrived, bearing an unusual wind, stronger than I had ever felt in that place, as if each gust were an urgent call for me to return to the abandoned cemetery. I walked slowly between the rusted gates that opened with a metallic creak, and the sensation of crossing an invisible border made me hesitate for a moment. But curiosity mixed with fear pushed me deeper into that space that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. The sky was shrouded in dense clouds that obscured the moon, and darkness stretched like a thick blanket over the cracked tombstones, creating the impression that I was walking in a landscape where time had long since stopped. As the wind began to blow violently between the crooked crosses and abandoned mausoleums, the whispers returned with frightening intensity, forming a chorus that filled every corner of the cemetery. They were no longer stray phrases or scattered names, but a frenetic sequence, as if dozens of voices were simultaneously shouting an endless list of people. I recognized several names, neighbors and acquaintances from the community, and with each repetition, the dread grew, for it seemed as if the wind was scratching out, one by one, destinies that would soon be fulfilled. Suddenly, the tumult of voices abruptly ceased, leaving only a single, deeper, more drawn-out voice echoing directly in my ears. This voice insistently repeated a single name with disturbing clarity, and it took a few seconds for me to realize what I was hearing. It was my name, repeated once, twice, 3 times, until each syllable sounded like a sharp blow to my sanity. I felt my legs weaken and my heart race to the point of suffocation, and the only thing I could think was that the list had come to an end. And now it was my turn to be called. The pressure of that moment was so intense that I felt as if the very tombstones were vibrating around me, as if the entire cemetery were witnessing the sentence that had just been pronounced. And it was in that instant of absolute horror that I realized I was not just a spectator to the curse, but the next name to be blown away. And the confession that would come after would make it clear that there was no escape from this fate. Since that night, my life has never been the same, because the sound of my own name, whispered on the wind, still echoes in my mind like an indelible scar. I abandoned my work as a cemetery patroller, but the decision didn't bring the peace I'd hoped for, since on quieter nights I can still swear I hear the same drawn-out intonation, repeating syllables that permeate the walls of my house and reach me when I'm alone. I carry the constant feeling that I'm not just another survivor of this experience, but someone who has been permanently marked, as if added to an invisible list that continues its relentless course, waiting only for the right time to exact its price. There were times when I tried to convince myself it was all just a hallucination, born of the fatigue and loneliness that accompany the lives of those who work surrounded by death. But this explanation fades whenever I recall the names I heard, and that appeared days later in the obituaries. This is no coincidence, but rather a macabre reckoning that continues to this day, a prophecy whispered on the wind, one that no one should hear, but which insists on finding the ears of those unprepared to carry such a burden. So I leave you with a warning. If you ever find yourself in an abandoned cemetery and feel the wind blowing differently, bringing words that seem to form names, don't stay, don't listen, simply leave before it's too late. If you've been hooked on this story until the end, Subscribe to the channel now and stay tuned for future videos, because there are even more disturbing stories waiting to be revealed, and some of them may be even harder to forget.